Right, well, let's go ahead and get started with the next session here, everyone. Next, we're going to be talking about, this session is called Ship It. And I know from my own experience with shipping apps that, developing the app itself takes 90% of the time, and then shipping it takes the other 90% of the time. So either because of problems with the app or because the web service isn't ready or something like that. So we have two people here to tell you about how to deal with these issues and get your app out the door. And first, we have Cynthia Maxwell to tell you about how to get your app shipped.
Hi there. So by show of hands, who here is developing an application right now? Oh my God. Wow, that's almost the entire room. So those of you who have your hands raised know this word intimately, right? I mean, it's the word that's haunting you day and night all the time. When you think about building an application, you have all these questions that come to mind. I have an idea, but how am I going to get that idea built? How will I keep the project on track? And how will I know when my product is ready to release? Now, if you look on the internet, you'll find all these success stories where people will say, yeah, we just put some engineers and designers in a conference room, there was some pizza and Red Bull, and we cranked out some agile sprints, and boom, our app was #1. That has absolutely not been my experience. What I've found is that shipping applications is really, really hard work. It takes a lot of discipline, it takes a lot of courage, and it takes knowing when to let go. So during the process of shipping, it feels like you're on a terrible balancing act. You're constantly trying to manage this tug of war between the speed of application development and the quality of the product that you're building. Along the way, you have all these decisions to make and corrections and adjustments. So I want to share with you some lessons that I've learned over the past few years about building applications and talk to you a little bit about the key learnings that I found that have really helped my team succeed. So for full disclosure on these lessons, some of them I learned during the application process. Some of them I only realized months later after having aha moments on the couch. And some of them I really believe, but I struggle to implement even today. So if you work alone, if you work for yourself, and you really don't care how long it takes to get the app out the door, then maybe this talk isn't for you. But if you work on a team, if you're developing for someone else, like say a client, or a CEO, or a product manager, then I'm really hoping that these lessons will help you. So let's take a look at the crucible of application development that have really helped forge these lessons into my brain. So this slide represents the landscape of the last 5 years of my life and the applications that I've been working on. So first up, the Mint application, which I developed in late 2008, early 2009. It was written with a client team of 2 engineers and 1.5 designers. It took 3 months to develop, and when it was finally released, it quickly became the #1 financial app on the App Store, and it earned the company several millions of dollars worth of free advertising over the holiday that it was released. Next up, in 2010, I worked on the remote application. This was developed at Apple. It was built with a client team of 3 engineers and 2 designers. It also took 3 months to build, and shortly after it was downloaded, it had tens of millions of users. And that was the first time I ever had seen a user number like that. And 10 million users, I thought that was a typo. It was frightening, but also exciting to know that that many people were running my lines of code. Next up, in 2011, I worked on the iTunes U application. This was written with 2 engineers and 2 designers. It took roughly 8 months to develop and has gone on to become one of the most popular Apple-made applications. In 2012, I helped write the Pinterest application. This was written with a client team of 3 engineers. It took less than 10 months to develop, and last year was inducted into the Apple App Hall of Fame. These days I'm working at Yahoo on a product that's yet to be released. This product is being built with a client team of 5 engineers and 2 designers, and hopefully will be reaching you soon. So as you can see, over the last 5 years, I spent an awful lot of time working on applications from small to large companies, on applications that vary in category from personal finance to home entertainment and to education, and applications that touch anywhere between 1 to 10 million users. So now that you understand the framework and like the ground floor that these lessons have come from, let's dive right in. So lesson number 1, build that one thing first and protect it at all costs. So what I found is that oftentimes product designers have an idea of what that one special thing in their application is. Maybe it's an interaction, maybe it's an animation, maybe it's an entire feature, but whatever that one thing is, put the most time and effort into building that up front. So here's some examples of some one special things from applications that I've worked on. So first up, in the remote application, we spent a lot of time polishing the directional control pad. So at the time, the iPad and the iPhone were still somewhat new, and the idea of having a device that you could make phone calls, browse the web, and now also control your television was seemingly very special. So this video shows using the iPad interface and the touch control in order to control the navigational elements of an Apple TV. So how many people here have used the remote application? How many people knew that there was a directional control? So basically about half or a third of the people who had their hands raised earlier. So I'll go back to that point later. Next up, in the iTunes U application, so this was released sometime after iBooks. So although this looks a lot like the iBooks interface, there's one slight difference here. This video shows what that difference is. I don't know if anyone can catch it, but I'll let the video play for a second so people can kind of try to make up their mind about what that is. Okay, time's up. That special interaction is actually the notebook opening. So although this looks very similar to the iBooks opening animation, instead of a book that just opens to the plane, we were really trying to simulate the cover going all the way back around the spiral binders. So most people that I talked to never even noticed that animation that we took so much time and effort building. It happens. So this is one freeze frame of that animation, which shows the cover kind of breaking the plane and starting its way back around itself. Next up, in the Pinterest application, we spent a tremendous amount of time trying to perfect the simulation of pulling a pin off the grid. And so this video shows a user reaching in with 2 fingers and scaling and zooming the pin out of the grid. So I don't think that this interaction is in the current shipping version of the Pinterest application, but at the time, getting this animation right absolutely blocked the shipping of this product. So now that we have an idea of like what some of these special things are, let's move on to the next lesson. Lesson number 2, a build doesn't have to be perfect to show it to other people. Now, this can be really hard to manage when you're dealing with pixel accurate people, the sort of people who can't even get a feel for what it is you're asking them to judge unless everything's perfectly aligned. I've definitely dealt with people like that, and I think it's better to kind of get hammered by them about pixel misalignments than it is to not get that early feedback of what it is you're trying to build. So I've done this twice before. Twice I feel like I've been so protective and so concerned about application perfection that I really missed some of that early feedback that my application needed. So whatever you do, make sure that you're able to get that feedback early and often, no matter what shape you feel the build is in. Lesson number 3, other people's opinions are not instructions for you. We all know that we're going to get feedback in the application process. Everybody loves to give you feedback about an application that you're showing them. The real key is knowing how to use that feedback. The thing is, you need to remember that not everybody's thinking about your app at the same depth that you are every day. Some people are thinking about it only during the session that you're asking them for feedback. Some people are thinking about it once a week, maybe in a product review that you have with them. But you, on the other hand, should be thinking about your application all the time. In the shower, driving the car, in the line at the grocery store, and on and on. So when you get that feedback, some of it you take, and some of it you file as enhancement requests. But just remember that you don't have to act on everyone else's opinion. Lesson number 4, focus on what the product is and not what the product isn't. So an example of what I mean by this is I've seen feedback loops where a team will put forth a myriad of ideas. Maybe it's a bunch of different button selections, or maybe it's a bunch of different animations or interactions. And then a decider might choose their top 2 or 3 from those. The team goes back, iterates on it, comes back with more selections. The top of those are chosen, the team goes back, and a week later, more are chosen, and on and on and on in this cycle. What I found is that whole process of design by elimination is incredibly time-consuming and is really, really draining on the design team. You can think about this as trying to define the recipe for a meal by throwing out food and then iterating on the food that stays on the table. It's going to be incredibly long to define that recipe, and it's really going to be a drain on creativity of the chef that's trying to define the meal. So if on the converse, you focus on what the product is and really what that product definition is, I think you can bring the vision into focus more clearly, and I think it does more justice to the team that's trying to have their voice echo in the product throughout the development cycle. So, next lesson, stay in a tight feedback loop with decision makers. It's really important that people who are deciding the fate of your product know what it is you're building and have the pulse of what direction that the application or the project is going in. And I've been in 2 sides of the spectrum, where on one hand, the feedback loop was so tight that I shared the same apartment and sat every night on the couch next to the decision maker or the lead designer. And in other hand, I've had to wait for a month at a time to get feedback from people that I really needed feedback from on my project. So obviously, the distance or the length of this loop is going to be determined by your access to these decision makers, but under no circumstances should you let really long periods of time go without letting these people know where you're taking the app and getting feedback from them about how you're doing. Lesson number 6, people see priority differently. So you can think about this like someone who's trying to draft the layout or the floor plan of a house and someone who's trying to choose the color of the walls. Both people can see the importance or focus of an application completely differently, and both people can be completely correct. So I found that this disconnect almost always happens between application architects and UI designers. But you absolutely have to make this collaboration work. This has happened to me in the past, and one way that we've worked around it is to maybe alternate focus weeks or sprints. So one week you're thinking about the architecture of the application and all the edge cases and all the ways that the application could fail and how to have the application recover from that. And then the next week, you're putting in all the assets, aligning everything to a grid, and getting everything pixel perfect. You can just alternate back and forth until you find a smooth collaboration between these people who see the application very differently, but make sure that they're both in their happy place with how it's working. Lesson number 7, have a product checklist and keep it updated. Does anybody know what this product is, the Homer? No? Okay, you do. Okay, this was Homer Simpson's dream car. This was the car for the everyman. It was going to have everything in it, 2 bubble roofs, 5 cup holders, and everything that he could imagine. And when he released it in the auto show, everyone was shocked and no one wanted it. This can happen to your application too very easily. It's really, really easy to start throwing in great idea after great idea. And I feel like this happens more often the closer that people get to shipping. I think that this happens because people start getting cold feet and they start second guessing all of their feature decisions that they made, and they think about taking a buckshot approach, trying to fill the holes of all the features that they think these imaginary customers are going to want. I think you definitely have to have discipline the closer you get to shipping about saying no to these last-minute feature ideas. Now, that's not to say that you write this product specification or PRD at the start of the project and it never changes until you ship. I mean, obviously you're going to learn things along the way and you're going to have to adjust this product checklist, but having a clear bullet point list of what the key features are or what the whole premise of the endeavor was will really be your North Star when these cold feet start to set in. So here's an example of a product checklist that my husband wrote for the Mint iPhone application. So we knew we needed to have easy access to financial data. We knew we wanted the application to ship before the holiday season, and we knew we needed to act really fast in order to beat the competition. So these three simple sentences were really the guideposts for how we approached the entire project. Lesson number 8, it's okay to stay in prototype phase. I think it's okay to stay in that phase longer than you think you should and longer than you feel comfortable. I think this lesson is actually harder for engineers to swallow than some designers. The reason that I think it's okay to let yourself stay in prototype phase is because you need to give yourself the space to vet those ideas and those special things that I was mentioning earlier before you start cementing them in application architecture. We all know that implementation comes with trade-offs, right? Before you know it, you're starting to give up on something from your idea because of speed of computation or memory of the device or some other sort of like implementation constraints. So why not first let yourself live in a world without those constraints in order to truly vet the core of the product? So lesson number 9, ship when the product is right and not just when it doesn't suck. So I'll give you an example of this. Over last year, I was advising for Concepts.io's Swell application. When I first saw the application, it seemed absolutely ready to go. The animations were smooth, the audio was buffering perfectly, it seemed absolutely ready to ship. But instead of shipping it, the CEO took a step back and he said, I don't think it's quite ready yet. Something's missing. And so we sat down and we took a look at the product and we teased out some of the features that we thought were really going to help its success. So the first thing that we did was we brought sharing first and foremost into the interface in order to help raise awareness of the application and its content on various social networks. And then secondarily, the team made sure that the content that was ready on the first day was going to be really, really high quality. So not only was the application going to be smooth, but the quality of the content was going to be great. So this was really hard for the CEO, Ram, because while all investors and people are kind of pushing to ship, he had the resolve and the discipline to step back and say, is my application going to survive that initial download frenzy and rush that happens when you ship an application and it gets promoted on the Apple App Store, for example? I really think that his discipline has done a lot of justice to the hard work his team has done, and it's really paying off. So the 10th lesson is that it might be better not to even ship your product at all. So, so I contend that the race to ship that I keep alluding to is actually really corroding a lot of the products that you find out there today. I think that people are having half-assed experiences, and frankly, they're getting frustrated by the actual applications that are supposed to be helping them. So I'll tell you how I learned this story. It wasn't even about an app, for example. But I learned this story in 2008. I had been working on an audio processing framework, and it was going to compute all of these really useful features of audio, and they were going to be used by creative people to really, implement their wild ideas. But one of the metrics that I was computing was only ever 97% accurate. Now, for an engineer, 97% sounds awesome. But for consumer software, that last 3% is really, really important, because when it fails for that 3%, it really hurts. So while I had been working on the software for over a year, and by all rights I should have been crushed when I found out that the scale of the release of this framework was going to be dramatically scaled back, the protection of that last 3% experience really taught me a valuable lesson. You really need to respect your users, and you really shouldn't be making promises of simplicity that aren't actually there in your product. If there's something that's wrong and you know it, maybe it's best just to pack it up, start on a different project, and walk away. So as I was making these slides, I kind of laughed at myself a little bit, because it kind of sounds like I'm plagiarizing Kenny Rogers. So if it helps people remember them, we'll go ahead and restate them this way. Lesson 9, know when to hold them. Lesson 10, know when to fold them. So I'm going to leave you with this thought, which I think really sums up the sentiment. I've heard this stated many different ways. So shipping is about choosing the right bugs. And I've also heard it stated, ship the bugs you can live with. Because in the end, you're not going to 100% know that the product that you make is going to be successful, no matter how well designed or engineered it was. Each time the product that I made went out, we had absolutely no idea what was going to happen. In the end, the app that you release is going to be the totality and the embodiment of all the good and bad decisions that your team made along the way. And as I demonstrated earlier, there'll be blood and sweat poured into decisions and features that no one even notices. So, no matter what the result of your application is, no matter how many downloads, how many DAUs, or how many stars you have on the App Store, please make sure that the team that built the application is still intact and that they're ready for battle on launch day. Because don't forget that when you're building an app, you're also building a team. And for the team, shipping the application is really just the beginning. Thanks.
We'll do Q&A after. Okay, thank you, Cynthia. And now we're going to have Ed Enough from Apigee. Ed, take it away.
Thanks. Hi. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is User Grid, which, as the title indicates, is a mobile backend-as-a-service. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about was kind of the journey of building it and some of the lessons learned from that. I think it'll give you maybe some parallels to what you just heard, but from the server side. There were a lot of interesting challenges that we hit as we built it. So, just introduced myself. I am from Apigee. For those of you who don't know, we do API management, API analytics, various tools for building your APIs out. User Grid is a backend-as-a-service, so if you've used it, that's awesome. Apigee runs a lot of workshops and conferences. In fact, there's one going on downstairs right now that talks about how to build your apps on it. You may have used others such as Parse, StackMob, Kinvi, and so on. There's various companies out there that have been addressing this concept. And really what it's all about is how do you power mobile and rich client applications. And so, the concept of the mobile backend-as-a-service is that you're looking to create cloud-powered applications with just your app logic, a cloud service, and HTTP APIs, and not have to go and do your development around the conventional web stack. Because kind of the idea is, why should you have to start every mobile application project from server-side programming? If you go and look at what you need to build a typical mobile application, there's actually a set of services that you see over and over again that are combined in different ways, and you could probably deconstruct almost any modern social application, something like Foursquare, and you'd find the same patterns all over again, used over and over again. And so this was kind of the genesis of this idea, was to go and say that mobile application developers want to be able to go and focus on building really high quality experiences that they can deliver on multiple devices and so on, and not have to worry about the server-side infrastructure, have things like analytics built in and all of that. So in the context of User Grid, this was an idea that we started work on in 2010. I had been at a company called 6apart, a blogging company, did products like movable type and typepad and all that, and we'd seen a lot of the shifts to mobile and sort of this whole API thing taking off. And so there was this idea that maybe with these types of functionality, social content, data analytics could all just be delivered via APIs. Most of 2010 and early part of 2011 was in development, and we started to then work with a set of beta testers. At the same time, trying to raise funding. And I'll talk a little bit about the logic of some of these milestones, as I go along the presentation. We did an open source release. We very shortly afterwards got acquired by Apigee, a large enterprise API platform company. We launched the product under the Apigee name as a service in 2011. Started getting enterprise customers as well as mobile customer, independent developers and so on in bulk. In 2012, among other things, we also took it to the open source component to the Apache Foundation, where it's now Apache User Grid, which was a pretty cool milestone that happened a couple of months ago. So in terms of kind of, I thought some of the points made in the previous presentation were really spot on in kind of sort of understanding what's the kind of essential need that you're trying to address. And what we came to the table on saying was, look, mobile development is hard enough to excel at without having to spend basically 30 minutes of every hour also fiddling with your cloud stack. And if you could sort of address that, essentially you double productivity, which is a pretty compelling idea. Who wouldn't want to be able to ship their apps in half the time? But we then broke that up into kind of a set of challenges, and these weren't, it's interesting because actually only the first one was a technical challenge, which was kind of this core central architectural idea that we kept reminding ourselves, which was this is a platform not powering a single app. And that means that everything we address, from how we build this out, from what technologies we use, architecture we select, team members we recruit, beta testers that we bring to the table, and so on, all are going to have to reinforce this idea. And then that drove kind of the follow-on ideas, which were, okay, when we get this thing far enough along that we can start getting feedback and getting people working on it, who are going to be the right early users? And then once we get past that, what are going to be the mechanisms that go and are effective in getting more people onto this thing? Because keep in mind, this is a different challenge than I've faced in past lives where it was just like, okay, we're launching an app, we got to build the right end user features. This is a product for developers, folks like many, if not all of you. And it's not as simple as going and getting sort of a great write-up in TechCrunch to get people to want to use this. So let's take a look at what those challenges looked like in depth and kind of why they were challenges or interesting problems to try to solve. So from this idea of building a platform, so again, if I was just figuring out how to make it easy to build a single app, and I was looking at this from sort of a developer tool that addressed that. Let's suppose I was working on something like PhoneGap or something. Great tools that are not inherently trying to solve a sort of platform scale problem. They are platforms, but every developer is kind of that uses it is sort of, or every development team is kind of a silo in and of themselves. And so in a situation like that, you've got a developer or maybe a small developer team building one app that's satisfying a set of users, each using a multiple device. When we started thinking about it from a platform standpoint, we had this situation, which is we have multiple teams. Every team is going to go, and this platform idea, we embraced this idea not just from a technology standpoint, but also the idea that people would start treating their apps as platforms, This was sort of in the early days of apps, 2009, 2010. Most people were struggling to have their one great app, but the point of building businesses around apps was that you were going to start to have a suite of them. Today, when you go and look at even a company like Coca-Cola has 30-something apps. You see, I was reading this morning, that Facebook's taking the strategy now where they're rolling out multiple point apps. The idea was that, building the one great app wasn't going to cut it. You had to enable people to build multiple apps. Each app was going to have a large number of users. We all want our apps to be successful and have, tens of millions of users or what have you. Each one of those users represents multiple potential devices. In fact, this was one of the things that we started to see. I believe this was in the 2011 holiday season. You started to see Amazon going and advertising the fact that you could start reading your book on the Kindle and then switch over to your iPad, and then maybe while you're in the coffee shop, pull out your iPhone and read a couple of chapters, and that sort of your personalization, the user state, mainly where you are in the book, and your library of books that you own, all sort of moved seamlessly wherever you were. So the idea of multiple devices per user. But from a platform standpoint, what we knew was that this was going to have to be sort of a multi-tenancy at scale problem, which meant that we wanted to have thousands, tens of thousands, there's currently hundreds of thousands of teams on this platform, each with, if they're successful, multiple apps and so on and so on. So this turned out to be a pretty significant engineering infrastructure problem. In fact, if anything, this sort of eclipsed most of our other considerations. If you looked at sort of what the core team was working on at any point in time, it was about like, how are we making this possible? Because if we don't have this, we don't have anything. There's plenty of other alternatives people can use to build the backends for their apps. If there's going to be a company that's providing this stuff as a service, it means that they need to be able to solve this in a super efficient manner so that they can do this in bulk cheaper than anybody could individually. And so this led us to having to deal with a bunch of new technologies. We had to work with immature database technology, using a database called Cassandra, very scalable, some would say sort of infinitely scalable horizontally. We found that wasn't entirely true. Dealing with elastic deployment. So again, this is a service that we were going to provide to other people as kind of our core business model, which meant that, it had to be elastic. It meant that when I launch this thing, if I have 5 customers, it needs to be able to run on one server, because we can't afford to go and own 1,000 servers while waiting for people to show up. That said, when customer number 6 through 50 sign up, it means that somebody shouldn't be going and logging into the Amazon console and provisioning servers. It's just got to automatically scale up. Figuring out how to work with making this available to developers meant that we had to go and sort of deal with some interesting things, new types of API models, REST APIs, as well as SDKs. We actually had some missteps on this where we had some kind of engineering architectural purist views all around the team, where we were like, wow, REST is super cool. You don't even need an SDK. We didn't fully appreciate the fact that, particularly even within iOS didn't out of the box have really great REST clients for making API calls. So, when we started looking at what other people were doing, people like Parse were really innovating with SDK, because there was this last mile gap. It wasn't enough to go and say, wow, I have this super great cloud service. If I didn't have a drop-in SDK, there was a problem. And then the learning curve, this was another area where we came to the table with some really great capabilities, but we started to see that some of the other folks that were trying to address this backend-as-a-service concept had really great user on-ramps, things like interactive smart docks, where you could kind of test out your your API calls, or you could actually go and you'd sign in and they'd give you like Objective-C code to copy and paste directly into your app and all that sort of stuff. And these were all kind of things that we didn't necessarily understand were going to be requirements. We were really focused on how do we build this, massively scalable system, but these all proved, incredibly important, particularly these last two that I don't think were necessarily as ingrained in the core mission. Who are our role models when you're building a service like this? Who do you look around and go and say, wow, these guys did it, we can do it too. It's always important to have these things because you sort of, it helps you bring the right focus onto what are the core problems, serves to be good inspiration. You want to, and it also helps in decoding what your business model should be. We looked at GitHub, looked at Heroku, we looked at WordPress. These were all companies that did an interesting combination of things. They did solve, they all had to solve that kind of massive multi-tenancy at scale, being able to make it super cheap through having this scalable platform where anybody can sign up essentially with a free account and get incredibly high levels of utility out of it before they have to shell out, put their credit card on the table. They all leveraged open source in really important ways, and this was not a lesson that we initially understood. And in fact, I think if we had gone and sort of actually started with these role models, I think it would have clarified a lot of our goals earlier. They all had managed to build a differentiation from larger established, and by established I mean multi-year established people with 5-10 years head start in kind of what people would have defined in a broader sense the categories they were playing in. Certainly GitHub was pretty much the last in from source code hosting, version control, even almost sort of every aspect of what you would look at. Same thing for Heroku. Same thing for WordPress. WordPress, when it entered already, there were people like 6apart already in the market, and in each case, sort of resoundingly thrashed the incumbent players. They all leveraged open source in an interesting way, not in the sort of conventional Red Hat model of saying I'm going to go sell support on top of open source, which is a model that, as plenty of software executives, who still have axes to grind on against open source, are happy to tell me that nobody other than Red Hat ever made money with open source. The reality is that each one of these vendors actually found a way to do it, but again, not by going and selling these support plans. And so, these were sort of, like I said, helpful goalposts, and you'll see kind of how we sort of went back and revisited those as we started to get this stuff out there. In 2011, we started working with a bunch of different developers on the platform. Most of them failed resoundingly on this in really horrible ways. This is one of those interesting challenges of when you go and say, wow, I'm going to create a platform for other developers to build on, getting this stuff out there. It sounds really great. We're developers. We all want to work with developers. We like customers that are like ourselves. But you're sort of inserting yourself within sort of the value chain of people's livelihood, and they're going to put pretty high requirements on you. So one of the things that became really important was to try to figure out who are these people. So we did a little bit of sort of head scratching and looked at kind of the history of internet technologies as they were adopted by people for building websites, building applications, building various types of web presences, people doing quote unquote e-business and e-commerce. And you found that pretty much in every case, technologies went through a sort of set of adoption. The first people who would use something And would absolutely never ever pay for it would be sort of the startups. You know, whether you had a content management system, whether you had portal software, whether you had e-commerce stacks or whatever. You get the startups that would go and use it. They would try it out. They'd give you a lot of great feedback. There were sort of the internet portal pure play companies. This means people like Yahoo, Google, et cetera, eBay, who would, you know, have some interest in it, but would ultimately build it all themselves and throw a lot of people at that. And then the people who would actually pay you for using this stuff would typically be sort of in order of adoption media companies, because media companies needed to reach people at internet scale, but couldn't afford to recruit people to build it themselves. The e-commerce guys, because for no other reason that they needed to have the web presences that were on the other side of the ad clicks that the media companies were running. Various verticals, often telco, maybe hotel chains or whatever. Then kind of inside the firewall, enterprise would be sort of the last area that you'd get, and then small business. And so we said, okay, you know, we're going to go and focus on some startups because we'll get some great feedback, even though ultimately it'll all end in tears. We'll then get some media companies, commerce companies, and so on, and that's pretty much what we ended up doing. Worked with a cool startup called KeepSafe. They used our platform for about 6 months for trying to manage their user registration and also getting analytics. They hit a lot of the scalability challenge. We thought we'd solved all the scalability issues. You know, I spent all that time talking to you about how we were going to build the most scalable system. Reality was that all of our testing really didn't indicate, didn't show what sort of real world traffic would look like. So making it scale. You know, I spent Christmas Eve on 2011 keeping this system up and running because it kept going down because these guys were driving so many users against it. Their app was taken off. Our service was going down. You know, and yay, DevOps, you do it all yourself. That meant, you know, Christmas Eve was pretty fun. Analytics, we found we needed to do a lot of work. They wanted, you know, SQL-style analytics. We did not have those mechanisms for getting your data out there, for finding out who your users were. They wanted to do cohort analysis. All this cool stuff that you would expect that if you were building a data backend for a mobile app that you'd want to see. Because otherwise, if this platform didn't have all that stuff, you could just go and use Mongo. And then we also found that this is where we first started to see that you had a pretty big impedance mismatch that you need to address through an SDK. Trend Spotter, this was kind of a good example of getting out of our comfort zone. This was a real-time app. Essentially, you know, main things we learned from this, though, were that HTML5 and JavaScript and PhoneGap were a super viable development environment and that you needed to support that. And so add another platform to the SDK list. We also started to see the value of real-time analytics. Worked with a few other beta testers, a large blog network, a local blog network principally centered in New York. We started to see location tagged content being a big deal. We also saw the idea that people didn't just want this thing to be a database, they also sort of wanted it to be a CMS. Photo sharing app, similar stuff. We needed binary assets, needed to be able to upload photos, had to add that capability. Also, again, started to see location. And so, you know, we came out of this with some interesting feedback. We saw that again, scalability, reliability were everything. People were not going to go and use sort of the turnkey Backend-as-a-Service if it wasn't going to be running, you know, 24/7. And it didn't matter what they were paying for it. I mean, it was like, if I'm paying $10 a month, I still expect this thing never to go down. Also started to see some interesting stuff like location starting to kind of escalate in terms of the use cases of stuff we did that they really liked, because it turned out that we did location tag data really better than anybody else at very high levels of scale. And so that's some of the findings on this. Again, reliability, scalability king. Competition was do it yourself. So a lot of people would come and talk to me and say, hey, you know, why are you guys doing this thing? Because, you know, Parse is awesome. And I was like, you know what? I haven't talked to a single person who's using Parse. I'm talking to a ton of people who are using Node.js and Mongo and want to know why they should use this, or Ruby and Rails on Heroku. but I don't think the competition are the other backends as a service. And a lot of people, even though you sort of had this kind of romantic notion, people don't want to know what's in it. It's cloud, it's turnkey, it's a black box. Actually, people are asking an awful lot of questions of what the heck is in this thing, even though they didn't want to run it themselves. But there was definitely a trust and transparency issue. And the larger customers, this was an interesting thing. For a lot of companies that try to do this stuff, they go and sort of like try to cross this chasm. They're working with little startups, and then they want to go and work with enterprises. In fact, as I was talking to investors, I would go and say, we're going to go and work with people like Best Buy or whatever. They're going to need stuff like this, and the VCs would be like, that's never going to happen. They are never going to trust a startup. I can't name names of enterprise customers that are working with us, but suffice to say, people came back and started to use this thing that people told us would never use it. Part of that came about by addressing this area about the larger users wanting sort of transparency and wanting to avoid lock-in and so on. And in fact, this is what triggered probably one of our most major pivots towards open source. This was not one of those situations where you go and say, wow, we're going to go open source and it's going to be like a neutron bomb or whatever. I've heard variants of this ever since the first day I got into software. You'd go and get your app, and if you couldn't be the #1 player, you'd go and say, I'm going to make this public domain, we do whatever. Actually, what we saw was, first, yes, we saw the competitors, but we saw that the reality was, regardless of the money chasing competitors, that the idea was, Node.js or Ruby or whatever people were using over and over again. People were using MongoDB or MySQL or whatever over and over again. And that the principal issues that were, the objections to adopting this stuff, reliability, transparency, lock-in, and, going back to who our heroes were, and it's people like GitHub and WordPress and Heroku, we said, okay, maybe there's a play here. We did go and become the first open source backend-as-a-service platform. There are a few others out there. Some of them are actually pretty good, but we were the first ones out there. And so we actually also became the first backend-as-a-service, not just used by serious app developers, but also the first backend-as-a-service that was used by telco carriers. This was about 3 months in. The first that was used by major retailers. Several of the big retailers that you probably bought consumer electronics from over the holidays, powered by the user grid platform. And actually, the first platform that ended up being used and white labeled by other backend-as-a-service players. So these were some interesting, very important use cases and sort of users that we would not have gotten if we hadn't done that pivot. And also didn't impact in the least our ability actually to get large customers to go and sign up from an enterprise standpoint for this. So final thing I want to talk about is kind of what worked and what didn't when we actually got this thing out there and went to get people to sign up for it. So what didn't work? Hackathons absolutely did not work in getting developers to sign up. Meetups, going to cloud meetups of various sorts, talking to people, conferences, even great conferences like this. I would not be here today to go if the goal was just get you guys all to sign up for it. I would love for you to do that. I think there's a lot of cool stuff there that you'll benefit from. But in terms of just getting lots of developers to come and work with it, those weren't the mechanisms that worked either. Tech blogs, getting on TechCrunch, great, but for getting a developer tool, that's not what moved the needle for going and get people to sign up for these things. What started to get things to work was actually sort of the hands-on working with developers, doing workshops, doing all of this sort of stuff. Because ultimately, you needed to actually sort of get hands-on in sort of bring your app, work with us, and so on, and solve these coding level problems. And, the interesting thing is that I think this realization has started to permeate the industry. You know, when I went to Worldwide Developer Conference this year, you know, as I'm sure, you know, a number of you probably also experienced, you know, the morning was going and doing concept presentations and so on and showing new technologies, but the afternoons were all workshops. Bring your code, work with engineers. And that's something that I think, you know, if you're wanting to work with developers, you sort of have to engage at that level. Otherwise, you know, it's very hard for them to get sort of, you know, value. It's one thing to sort of go and show, oh, here's how easy it is to do Hello World in, you know, 10 lines of code, or build a game in SpriteKit, or whatever the session you'd sit in the morning in WDC, but actually going and figuring out how to integrate it into your code proved to be very valuable. And so we switched over and started to do that, and that's where we actually started to, and these are some pictures, started to get just lots and lots of folks showing up, and this was pretty cool when we made that switch, and this was about a year ago, and at that point, we really started to get adoption, utilization of this thing, where an awful lot of apps started to get built on top of UserGrid. So, you know, what were some of the takeaways, you know, or actually what are some of the things that we'll be working on next on this stuff? So we're continuing to work with finding ways for big users to succeed on this stuff. Obviously, we want to be very successful for developers of all size, but kind of the economics of doing a platform like this, you know, your long tail economics, if you can't have apps at the highest levels of scale succeed on it, then the overall economic model doesn't work. The reality is that sort of the long tail of various forms of platform as a service, backend-as-a-service, and all that, you know, the idea that sort of like all the money of everybody under the curve would be more than what you made from like the 3 biggest customers, not actually true. It's a much flatter curve, at least for infrastructure type services. That said, the big guys don't actually use your stuff without seeing the validation of a bunch of other people using it. So you have to have sort of a very healthy distributed user base, but doing a lot of work on that sort of thing. Doing a wider net from open source. We took this to the Apache Foundation. That was really exciting. Gave us sort of a stamp of approval from that standpoint. That was particularly important for enterprise customers. Node.js. Node.js is basically, I think, transforming entirely how people of all sizes are viewing building their server-side infrastructure for their apps. And we see this at small startups. We see this at large retailers. We see this at large telcos, the largest mobile carriers in the world, all building their APIs on Node.js. That's very profound change that's happening that we are working around to make sure is a core part of the experience. Real-time and WebSocket. WebSockets are coming on very strong. And then just more and more dealing with big data, different types of analytics. People have sort of a never-ending hunger for all aspects of kind of instrumenting their applications and trying to make data-driven decisions. And if you want to be the back-end platform for a wide variety of mobile apps, it goes without saying that this has to be what you bring to the table. And so finally, some of the last takeaways. You know, it's interesting actually. I heard similar things on the previous presentation, but sort of what was this big essential problem? An idea that the mobile developer should be able to not have to, put 30 minutes of every hour building their back end. That was our core rallying cry, and at the end of the day, that was sort of the true north for us. But what were these fundamental differences? This idea that it was a platform, and not an app. Very easy to lose your way on this because honestly it meant that this sort of in many cases gave the engineers kind of free rein to go crazy and over-engineer and over-architect if they wanted to. So this is definitely kind of an art versus science type of thing and figuring out where to pull the reins back on that. And then kind of the last takeaway, of course, is that developers are the toughest customers, most fun to work with. If you can, build products that developers really like and use, it's awesome, but very challenging. Anyway, all of this stuff is not just available self-service free sign up on Apigee, but also available to download and run yourself. Here are some of the links. You can actually go and see the code on GitHub. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. I think we have just a little bit of time for Q&A here before we go into the next session. So if you got any questions for these two, be quick. Anyone?
It's gonna be fast.
Yes.
Hi, just wondering in terms of, from your perspective, what you see as the reasons for the widespread adoption of Node.js for backends.
Yeah, so I think that part of it is that essentially it's allowing, so a lot of us are, do sort of native first mobile development. And I think that that is going to continue for some time. But there's also a lot of folks who are kind of doing, the phone gap, the accelerator, the various types of HTML5 based development. And for them, what you end up with this situation where you sort of have JavaScript on the client, JavaScript on the wire with REST JSON, and then JavaScript on the server. And that, is kind of directionally what's making that happen. Also, I just think that for building APIs, again, the fact that even if your client is not JavaScript, your APIs tend to be REST/JSON, and that's kind of the lingua franca of Node. It's not that Ruby is not great and awesome and tons of people are building their backends on that. It's not that J2EE or actually it is. I'm a big Java guy from way back, but I still don't necessarily enjoy building my APIs that way. It doesn't mean that lots of enterprises won't for a long time to come. But it just seems like people are finding that it's much more productive from a Node.js standpoint, easier to debug on the desktop and so on. But the numbers seem to be bearing that out when you look at various indexes and of developer usage, and also anecdotally from what I've seen, it's getting much more widespread adoption, even in in very large enterprise accounts. And for somebody who has been through Java adoption, Python adoption, Ruby adoption, and so on, I'm very surprised that if I walk into dealing with a chief architect at like I said, a large telco, that they're actually, they have like 10 teams doing Node.js. I wouldn't have expected that. Normal adoption would have been that they would be using whatever was the hot language 5 years ago versus like what's the hot language from 5 weeks ago.